The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cedar Ridge shooting range as Jake Martinez pulled his battered pickup truck into the gravel parking lot. At 23, he looked more like a college student than someone who would change the world of competitive shooting forever. His worn jeans and faded baseball cap drew snickers from the seasoned marksmen gathering for the annual Mountain State Championship. "Look what the wind blew in," chuckled veteran shooter Bill Thompson, adjusting. His expensive shooting jacket adorned with sponsor patches. Thompson had held the range record for 15 years straight, a streak that seemed unbreakable. His .308 rifle, custom-built and worth more than Jake's truck, gleamed in the morning light. Jake quietly unpacked his equipment from the truck bed. His rifle was a modest Remington 700, inherited from his grandfather who had taught him to shoot on their small ranch in New Mexico. The scope was decent, but nothing fancy, and his shooting mat had seen better days. Other competitors exchanged knowing glances as they watched him set up his simple gear. The shooting range buzzed with conversation about Thompson's legendary record. 15 years ago, he had fired a group measuring just 0.187 inches at 100 yards during this very competition. It was a feat that had become the stuff of legend in precision shooting circles. Multiple shooters had come close over the years, but none had managed to surpass Thompson's mark. The record had become more than just a number. It was a symbol of perfection that seemed untouchable. "Hey, kid," called out Marcus Webb, another seasoned competitor who owned a gun shop in town. "You sure you're in the right place? The beginner's class is next month." His comment drew laughter from the small crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch the annual event. Jake simply nodded politely and continued his preparation routine. He had driven 8 hours from his hometown, using vacation days from his job at a local auto parts store to compete. His entry fee had stretched his budget thin, but something deep inside told him this was his moment. He had been shooting since he was 7 years old, learning the fundamentals from his grandfather who had been a Marine Corps sniper in Vietnam. The competition format was straightforward but demanding. Each shooter would fire a 5-shot group at 100 yards, and the smallest group would win. Wind conditions could make or break a score, and the pressure of competition had caused many excellent shooters to falter when it mattered most. The current conditions were tricky, with a slight crosswind that kept shifting direction every few minutes. As Jake lay prone behind his rifle, adjusting his position on the worn shooting mat, he could hear the whispered conversations behind him. The other competitors were already writing him off, focusing their attention on the real contenders like Thompson, Webb, and Sarah Chen, a rising star who had finished second the previous year. Thompson had just finished his string of shots, producing a respectable group that measured 0.223 inches. It was excellent shooting, but not quite good enough to break his own record. The crowd applauded respectfully as he cleared the firing line with the confidence of someone who had dominated this competition for over a decade. Webb shot next, his precision rifle barking 5 times in quick succession. His group measured 0.201 inches, putting him in temporary second place. The competition was heating up and several shooters still hadn't taken their turn. The wind had died down to almost nothing, creating ideal conditions for record-breaking accuracy. Sarah Chen approached the firing line with the focused intensity of a true competitor. Her custom rifle had cost more than many people's cars, and her shooting technique was flawless. She fired her 5 shots with mechanical precision, each shot breaking at exactly the same point in her breathing cycle. When the target was measured, her group came in at 0.194 inches, putting her in the lead and tantalizingly close to Thompson's record. The crowd grew more excited as they realized they might witness history in the making. Thompson watched nervously as other competitors took their turns, knowing that his 15-year reign might be coming to an end. The pressure was building, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. Jake watched and learned from each shooter, studying their techniques and noting how they dealt with the subtle wind conditions. His grandfather had always taught him that observation was just as important as practice. "Watch how others succeed and fail," the old Marine had said. "Learn from both." As more shooters completed their strings, it became clear that Chen's 0.194-inch group would be difficult to beat. Only 3 competitors remained, and none of them were considered serious threats to the record. The crowd began to settle in, expecting Chen to claim victory and come within a whisker of the legendary record. Jake was called to the firing line as the second-to-last shooter. The spectators paid little attention, many of them already beginning to pack up their equipment or congratulate Chen on her impressive shooting. Thompson had moved closer to watch, curious about the young man who had traveled so far to compete with such modest equipment. As Jake settled into position behind his rifle, the range fell quiet except for the distant sound of wind in the trees. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his grandfather's words about shooting from the heart as much as from the head. "Trust your training," the old man had always said. "When the moment comes, let everything else fade away." The first shot broke with a crisp crack that echoed across the range. Jake worked the bolt smoothly and settled in for his second shot, his breathing steady and controlled. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing something different about this unknown, young shooter. His rifle seemed to settle into position naturally as if it belonged there. Shot after shot, Jake's rifle spoke with authority. His technique was unconventional but effective, a blend of military precision and ranch-taught practicality that his grandfather had passed down through countless hours of practice. The final shot rang out, and Jake cleared his rifle and stepped back from the firing line. The range officer walked down range to measure the target, and a hush fell over the crowd as they waited for the results. This was the moment that would determine whether 15 years of dominance would continue or if a new chapter in competitive shooting was about to begin. The range officer knelt beside Jake's target, studying it through his magnifying glass with the careful attention of someone who had measured thousands of groups over the years. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see what had captured his attention so completely. Even Thompson, who rarely showed emotion during competitions, found himself leaning forward with curiosity. "Well, I'll be damned," the range officer muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. He measured again, double-checking his reading before standing up slowly. His weathered face wore an expression of disbelief as he looked back at the young man who had just fired the group. Sarah Chen felt her stomach drop as she watched the official's reaction. She had been certain her 0.194-inch group would be nearly impossible to beat, especially by someone shooting such basic equipment. The wind conditions had been perfect during her string, and she had executed every shot exactly as she had practiced, thousands of times. "Ladies and gentlemen," the range officer announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent shooting range, "we have a new leader." He paused dramatically, looking down at his measuring device one more time. "Jake Martinez has just fired a group measuring 0.161 inches. The announcement hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and several people actually gasped out loud. Chen's shoulders sagged as the reality sank in. Not only had this unknown young man beaten her score, but he had also shattered Thompson's 15-year record by a substantial margin. Thompson stared at the target in stunned silence. The 5 bullet holes were clustered so tightly together that they almost looked like a single ragged hole. It was the kind of shooting that most marksmen could only dream of achieving, accomplished with equipment that many competitors would have considered inadequate for serious competition. "That can't be right," Webb said loudly, pushing through the crowd to examine the target himself. "Let me see that measurement." His tone carried the desperation of someone who couldn't accept what he was witnessing. He had invested tens of thousands of dollars in precision equipment and countless hours in practice, only to watch a kid with a basic rifle make it all seem irrelevant. The range officer handed Webb the measuring device, inviting him to verify the measurement himself. Webb studied the target carefully, hoping to find some error or technicality that would invalidate the incredible group. But the 5 shots were undeniably clustered within a space smaller than Thompson's legendary record. Jake stood quietly behind the crowd, still processing what had just happened. He had known the shots felt good as they broke, each one seeming to find its way naturally to the center of the target. But he hadn't dared to hope that he had actually broken the record that had stood for so long. The noise of the crowd seemed distant and unreal, like something happening in a dream. "How long have you been shooting competitively?" asked a spectator who had been watching the competition with his teenage son. The question broke Jake out of his trance, reminding him that he was now the center of attention in a way he had never experienced before. "This is my first competition," Jake replied honestly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. The admission sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Not only had he broken a 15-year record, but he had done it in his very first competition. Thompson approached Jake with the measured steps of a man trying to maintain his dignity in defeat. Despite the disappointment of losing his record, he was a sportsman who understood the significance of what he had just witnessed. "That was incredible shooting, son," he said, extending his hand. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to beat that record, and you didn't just beat it, you demolished it." The handshake between the old champion and the new record holder was captured by several photographers who had been covering the event. None of them had expected to document such a historic moment when they arrived that morning. They had come expecting to see Thompson possibly extend his winning streak, or perhaps watch Chen make a serious run at the record. Chen walked over to congratulate Jake, her competitive disappointment tempered by genuine admiration for what she had witnessed. "That's the best shooting I've ever seen at this range," she said sincerely. "What's your secret?" She was genuinely curious about how someone with such basic equipment had managed to outshoot competitors with far more expensive and sophisticated gear. Jake thought about the question carefully before answering. "My grandfather taught me that the rifle is just a tool," he said. "The real accuracy comes from understanding yourself and working with the rifle instead of trying to force it to do what you want. He always said that fancy equipment can't replace good fundamentals and patience." The wisdom in his words resonated with several of the experienced shooters who had gathered around to hear his explanation. Many of them had become so focused on acquiring the latest and most expensive equipment that they had forgotten the basic principles that truly mattered in precision shooting. One more shooter remained to take his turn at the firing line. Frank Rodriguez, a local gunsmith who had been competing at this range for over 20 years, still had to complete his string. The crowd watched with renewed interest, wondering if they might witness another surprise in this already remarkable competition. Rodriguez had been shooting before Jake was born, and his experience showed in every aspect of his preparation and execution. His rifle was well maintained but not particularly fancy, and his technique was smooth and efficient. He fired his 5 shots with the rhythm of someone who had done this thousands of times before. When his target was measured, Rodriguez had produced a very respectable 0.298-inch group. Under normal circumstances, it would have been considered excellent shooting that might have placed him in the top 3. But on this day, it served mainly to emphasize just how extraordinary Jake's performance had been. The award ceremony was held immediately after the competition concluded. Jake found himself standing on the makeshift podium, holding a trophy that was larger and more elaborate than anything he had ever imagined winning. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in, but it still felt surreal. Local newspaper reporters conducted brief interviews with the top finishers, but most of their attention focused on the young man who had come out of nowhere to rewrite the record books. Jake answered their questions with the same quiet confidence he had shown throughout the competition, crediting his grandfather's teaching and emphasizing the importance of patience and fundamentals over expensive equipment. As the crowd began to disperse and competitors packed up their gear, several people approached Jake with business cards and offers of sponsorship. Equipment manufacturers wanted to know if he would be interested in testing their products, and shooting schools inquired about his availability to teach clinics and seminars. The transformation from unknown competitor to shooting celebrity had happened in the space of 5 trigger pulls, each one contributing to a group that measured smaller than anyone had thought possible with his equipment. Word of his achievement was already spreading through social media and online shooting forums, where the story of the young marksman who had humbled the establishment was being shared and discussed by thousands of enthusiasts. But for Jake, the most meaningful moment came when an elderly man approached him as he was loading his gear back into his truck. The stranger introduced himself as a fellow veteran who had served with Jake's grandfather in Vietnam. "He would have been proud of what you did today," the old soldier said quietly. "You honored his memory and his teaching in the best possible way." Within hours of leaving the Cedar Ridge shooting range, Jake's phone began ringing with calls from people he had never heard of. Word of his record-breaking performance had spread through the tight-knit precision shooting community faster than wildfire, and everyone wanted to know more about the young man who had appeared from nowhere to shatter a 15-year record. The drive back to New Mexico gave Jake time to process what had happened and consider what it might mean for his future. He had entered the competition with no expectations beyond testing himself against serious competitors. Now he found himself fielding calls from rifle manufacturers, ammunition companies, and shooting schools who wanted to discuss potential partnerships and sponsorship deals. His modest apartment in Alamogordo felt strangely small when he returned home the next evening. The trophy from the competition sat on his kitchen table, still seeming too large and impressive to belong to him. He had called in sick to work, needing time to handle the flood of phone calls and emails that continued to pour in from across the country. Jake's supervisor at the auto parts store, a gruff but fair man named Tom Garcia, had initially been skeptical about the young employee's claim of winning a major shooting competition. But when local news stations began calling the store asking for interviews with their record-setting employee, Garcia's attitude changed completely. Suddenly, having Jake on the payroll became a source of pride rather than just another name on the schedule. The story had legs beyond just the shooting community. Local television stations picked it up as a feel-good piece about the underdog who had triumphed against overwhelming odds. The narrative practically wrote itself. A working-class young man with basic equipment defeating wealthy competitors with custom rifles worth more than most people's cars. Jake's grandfather's old rifle, which had seemed so ordinary just days before, was now being discussed on online forums as if it were a legendary artifact. Shooting enthusiasts debated every detail of his equipment setup, trying to understand how such modest gear had produced such extraordinary results. Some refused to believe the story, insisting that there must have been some mistake in the measurement, or some other explanation for the impossible group. A week after the competition, Jake received a call that would change the trajectory of his life completely. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell, retired, who represented a group of investors interested in developing a new line of precision rifles. They had been following Jake's story and wanted to offer him a position as their lead test shooter and product development consultant. The offer was more money than Jake had ever imagined making, along with the opportunity to work full-time in the shooting sports industry. But what impressed him most was Colonel Mitchell's approach to the conversation. Instead of focusing only on Jake's recent achievement, Mitchell asked detailed questions about his grandfather's teaching methods and his philosophy about shooting. "What we're looking for," Mitchell explained during their phone conversation, "isn't just someone who can shoot small groups. We want someone who understands the principles behind accurate shooting and can help us build rifles that work with shooters, instead of requiring them to adapt to the rifle. Your grandfather sounds like he was cut from the same cloth as the old-school military instructors, who understood that fundamentals matter more than gadgets." The offer required Jake to relocate to Colorado, where the company was setting up their research and development facility. It meant leaving behind the familiar landscape of New Mexico and the small town where he had grown up, but it also represented an opportunity to honor his grandfather's memory by sharing the lessons he had learned. Jake's decision to accept the offer surprised some of his friends and family, who had expected him to capitalize on his newfound fame by entering more competitions and pursuing prize money and sponsorships. But Jake had never been motivated primarily by money or recognition. The opportunity to work in rifle development appealed to him because it offered a chance to help other shooters achieve their potential. His farewell party at the auto parts store was attended by more people than Jake had expected. Co-workers, customers, and local shooting enthusiasts gathered to wish him well and hear first-hand accounts of his record-breaking performance. Tom Garcia presented him with a commemorative plaque recognizing his achievement, joking that it was the first time in company history that an employee had become famous for something other than perfect attendance. The move to Colorado introduced Jake to a completely different world of precision shooting. The company's facility was equipped with indoor ranges, ballistics testing equipment, and manufacturing capabilities that dwarfed anything he had seen before. His new colleagues were engineers, former military snipers, and competitive shooters, who had devoted their careers to pushing the boundaries of rifle accuracy. During his first week on the job, Jake was asked to test a prototype rifle that the engineering team had been developing for over a year. The weapon incorporated several innovative design features intended to improve consistency and accuracy, but initial testing had produced disappointing results. Previous test shooters had struggled to achieve the level of precision that the theoretical design should have delivered. Jake approached the test session with the same methodical preparation that his grandfather had taught him. He spent time studying the rifle's specifications and discussing the design philosophy with the engineers who had created it. Instead of immediately heading to the range, he asked to disassemble and reassemble the rifle several times to understand its mechanical characteristics. When he finally began shooting the prototype, Jake's approach differed significantly from previous testers. Rather than trying to force the rifle to conform to his shooting style, he allowed his technique to adapt to the weapon's natural characteristics. The results were immediately apparent, with groups that were substantially tighter than anything achieved by earlier testers. The engineering team gathered around Jake's targets with expressions of amazement and vindication. Their design had been sound, but previous testers had approached it with preconceived notions about how a precision rifle should behave. Jake's willingness to work with the rifle instead of against it had unlocked its true potential. "This is exactly why we hired you," Colonel Mitchell said as he examined the test targets. "You're not just a good shooter, you're a problem solver who understands that every rifle has its own personality. That's a rare combination in this business." Jake's success with the prototype rifle led to additional responsibilities within the company. He began working directly with the engineering team on future designs, providing input based on his practical shooting experience and his grandfather's traditional approach to marksmanship. The combination of old-school fundamentals and cutting-edge technology proved to be a powerful formula. As word of Jake's work spread through the industry, other manufacturers began trying to recruit him. Offers arrived regularly from companies around the world, some promising even more money and better benefits. But Jake remained committed to Colonel Mitchell's company, appreciating their emphasis on fundamental shooting principles and their willingness to let him work according to his grandfather's philosophy. The success of the prototype rifle that Jake had tested led to the company's first major product launch. Marketing materials featured Jake's story prominently, emphasizing how traditional shooting skills had validated modern engineering concepts. The rifle was positioned as a weapon that rewarded good fundamentals rather than requiring expensive accessories and complicated adjustments. Initial sales exceeded all projections, with many customers specifically requesting the model that Jake had tested and helped develop. His reputation as the young marksman who had broken the 15-year record, combined with his role in developing successful new products, made him one of the most recognizable figures in the precision shooting industry. But success brought its own challenges. Jake found himself traveling frequently to trade shows, competitions, and training events where customers and media wanted to meet the person behind the story. The attention was flattering but sometimes overwhelming for someone who had grown up preferring the solitude of shooting practice on his grandfather's ranch. 2 years after breaking the record at Cedar Ridge, Jake found himself standing before an audience of over 500 people at the National Precision Shooting Convention. The convention hall buzzed with the excitement of manufacturers showcasing their latest innovations, but Jake's presentation was the most anticipated event of the entire weekend. His topic was Fundamentals over Equipment, Lessons from a Marine's Grandson, and the audience included some of the most accomplished shooters and industry experts in the world. Many had come specifically to hear Jake explain how his grandfather's traditional approach to marksmanship had enabled him to outshoot competitors with far more expensive equipment. The presentation began with a video montage showing Jake's journey from that first competition to his current role as one of the industry's most respected consultants. Clips from his record-breaking performance at Cedar Ridge were followed by footage of him testing prototype rifles and teaching shooting clinics across the country. The transformation from unknown competitor to industry leader was remarkable to witness. Jake spoke with the same quiet confidence that had characterized his approach to shooting. He explained his grandfather's teaching philosophy, emphasizing patience, consistency, and mental discipline over equipment specifications and technical modifications. The audience listened intently as he described how these principles had guided both his competitive success and his approach to rifle development. "My grandfather used to say that the rifle doesn't know how much you paid for it," Jake told the audience, drawing laughter from experienced shooters who understood the truth behind the humor. A $500 rifle in the hands of someone who understands fundamentals will outshoot a $5,000 rifle in the hands of someone who relies on equipment to compensate for poor technique. The presentation included live demonstrations of shooting techniques, with Jake using rifles provided by various manufacturers. He showed how the same fundamental principles applied regardless of the specific equipment, and how understanding each rifle's characteristics was more important than having the most expensive gear available. During the question and answer session that followed his presentation, Jake was asked about the criticism he sometimes received from traditionalists who felt he had sold out by working with manufacturers. His response reflected the maturity he had gained during his 2 years in the industry. "My grandfather's goal was never to keep his knowledge secret," Jake explained. "He taught me everything he knew because he wanted those lessons to be passed on to others. Working with manufacturers gives me the opportunity to influence the design of rifles that thousands of shooters will use. If I can help create products that reward good fundamentals instead of masking poor technique, I'm honoring his memory in the best way possible." After the presentation, Jake was approached by Maria Santos, a documentary filmmaker who had been following his story since the Cedar Ridge competition. She had been filming interviews with competitors from that day and tracking Jake's subsequent career for a project about the evolution of precision shooting sports. "I'd like to get your permission to film at your grandfather's ranch," Maria explained. "I think viewers would be interested in seeing where you learned to shoot and understanding more about the man who taught you. It would provide important context for your story and help people understand where your philosophy comes from." The request touched Jake deeply. He had not returned to the ranch since accepting the job in Colorado, partly because his busy schedule made it difficult to find time for personal trips, but he also recognized that visiting the places where his grandfather had taught him would be emotionally challenging, bringing back memories of the man who had shaped his understanding of shooting and life. Jake agreed to the filming project, with the understanding that the focus would remain on his grandfather's teaching methods rather than turning into an overly personal exploration of their relationship. The documentary crew traveled to New Mexico the following month, accompanied by Jake and several of the rifles he had used in competitions and product development. The ranch looked smaller than Jake remembered, but the shooting range his grandfather had built behind the house remained exactly as it had been during his childhood. The old backstop was still solid, and the wooden shooting bench showed the wear patterns created by countless hours of practice. Standing there again brought back a flood of memories about the lessons that had shaped his approach to shooting and life. Maria's cameras captured Jake setting up the same Remington 700 that had broken the record at Cedar Ridge, demonstrating the techniques his grandfather had taught him on this very range. The windage and elevation adjustments on the scope were still set exactly as they had been during that historic competition, a detail that Jake had never changed out of respect for the achievement they had helped create. As Jake fired groups downrange, he explained for the camera how his grandfather had taught him to read wind conditions, control his breathing, and develop the mental discipline necessary for consistent accuracy. The informal, conversational tone of the filming session created a relaxed atmosphere that allowed Jake to share insights he rarely discussed in more formal presentations. The documentary crew also interviewed several of Jake's former co-workers from the auto parts store, including Tom Garcia, who had become something of a local celebrity himself as the supervisor who had given Jake time off to compete at Cedar Ridge. Their perspectives provided a valuable counterpoint to the industry, acclaim Jake had received, showing how his success had impacted the people who had known him before he became famous. During the filming at the ranch, Jake discovered a box of his grandfather's shooting journals that he had not seen since childhood. The journals contained detailed records of shooting sessions, weather conditions, ammunition testing, and observations about technique that spanned decades of practice and competition. Reading through them, Jake found the theoretical foundation for many of the practical lessons his grandfather had taught him. One journal entry, written shortly after Jake's grandfather returned from Vietnam, captured the philosophy that had guided his approach to teaching marksmanship. Shooting accurately isn't about having the best equipment or knowing the most advanced techniques. It's about understanding yourself well enough to be consistent and respecting the rifle enough to work with it instead of against it. Everything else is just details. The documentary project expanded beyond its original scope as Maria realized the broader significance of Jake's story. It wasn't just about one person's success in competitive shooting. It represented a clash between traditional craftsmanship and modern technology, between time-tested wisdom and contemporary innovation. Jake had managed to bridge these worlds by applying old-school principles to cutting-edge equipment development. When filming concluded, Jake made the decision to purchase his grandfather's ranch from the estate, ensuring that the property would remain in the family and preserving the shooting range where his journey had begun. The ranch would serve as a retreat from his increasingly busy career and as a place where he could continue developing his skills according to his grandfather's methods. The documentary, titled The Last Lesson, premiered at several film festivals before being picked up by a major streaming service. Critics praised it as both an engaging sports story and a thoughtful exploration of how traditional skills remain relevant in an increasingly technological world. The film introduced Jake's story to audiences far beyond the shooting sports community. Success brought new opportunities and challenges. Jake was invited to consult on rifle designs for military and law enforcement applications, bringing his understanding of fundamental marksmanship to products that could save lives in critical situations. The responsibility was both exciting and sobering, knowing that his input might influence equipment used by people who depended on accuracy for their survival. But perhaps the most meaningful development was Jake's decision to establish a shooting school at his grandfather's ranch. The school would offer intensive courses focused on fundamental marksmanship skills, taught according to the principles his grandfather had passed down. Students would learn on the same range where Jake had developed his abilities, using a curriculum that emphasized understanding and patience over quick fixes and expensive gear. The first class at the school included Sarah Chen, the shooter who had placed second at Cedar Ridge, along with several other competitive shooters who wanted to understand Jake's approach to accuracy. The irony was not lost on anyone that Chen, who had initially been defeated by Jake's fundamentals-based approach, was now paying to learn those same principles. 5 years after his record-breaking performance at Cedar Ridge, Jake stood at the edge of his grandfather's shooting range, watching the sun rise over the New Mexico landscape. The Martinez Marksmanship Academy had grown beyond his wildest expectations, with waiting lists that extended months into the future and students traveling from around the world to train on the ranch where it all began. The morning routine had become sacred to Jake. Each day began with a solitary session at the bench his grandfather had built, firing the same Remington 700 that had changed his life. These quiet moments allowed him to maintain his connection to the principles that had guided his journey, while preparing mentally for the challenges each day would bring. Today would be particularly significant. Bill Thompson, the former record D holder whose 15-year reign Jake had ended, was arriving as a guest instructor for a special clinic, focusing on competitive pressure management. The relationship between the two men had evolved from that initial moment of shocked silence at Cedar Ridge to a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared passion for the shooting sports. Thompson's journey since losing his record had been remarkable in its own way. Instead of retreating from competition or becoming bitter about his defeat, he had used the experience as motivation to examine and improve his own shooting methods. The result had been some of the best shooting of his career, even though he never quite managed to reclaim his record. The Academy's curriculum reflected Jake's belief that mental preparation was just as important as technical skill. Students spent as much time learning about concentration, breathing control, and pressure management as they did studying ballistics and equipment maintenance. The approach had proven successful, with Academy graduates consistently performing well in competitions across the country. Jake had also expanded the Academy's mission beyond competitive shooting. Law enforcement officers, military personnel, and hunters attended specialized courses designed to apply fundamental marksmanship principles to their specific needs. The ranch had become a destination for anyone seeking to understand the deeper aspects of accurate shooting. The success of the academy had allowed Jake to pursue projects that might not have been commercially viable otherwise. He had established a scholarship program for young shooters who couldn't afford the academy's tuition, ensuring that financial circumstances wouldn't prevent promising students from accessing quality instruction. The scholarship recipients often became some of the most dedicated and successful graduates. Maria Santos returned periodically to film updates to her documentary, capturing the academy's growth and Jake's evolution as an instructor and industry leader. Her latest footage showed Jake working with a class that included an Olympic hopeful, a police sniper, and a grandfather teaching his teenage granddaughter to shoot competitively. The diversity of students reflected how broadly Jake's teaching methods could be applied. One of the most gratifying aspects of the academy's success was seeing former students achieve their own breakthrough moments. Jake received regular updates about competition victories, successful hunts, and qualification achievements by people who had trained at the ranch. Each success felt like validation of his grandfather's teaching philosophy and proof that fundamental skills could still triumph in an increasingly technology-focused world. The academy had also become a testing ground for rifle manufacturers, seeking Jake's input on new designs. Companies would send prototype rifles to the ranch, where Jake and his most advanced students would put them through comprehensive evaluations. The feedback from these sessions influenced product development decisions and helped manufacturers create rifles that rewarded good shooting fundamentals. Jake's influence extended beyond the shooting sports community through his involvement in youth programs and educational initiatives. He had partnered with schools and youth organizations to develop curricula that used marksmanship training to teach broader lessons about discipline, patience, and goal setting. These programs often reached young people who might never have considered shooting sports otherwise. The 5th anniversary of his record-breaking performance was approaching, and Jake had been invited back to Cedar Ridge for a commemorative event. The range had installed a permanent display honoring his achievement, including the target from his historic group and information about the academy he had established. The display had become a popular attraction for visitors to the range, but Jake's focus remained on continuing to learn and improve, rather than celebrating past achievements. He had recently begun working with sports psychologists and performance coaches from other disciplines, seeking to understand how principles from fields like golf, archery, and even music could enhance shooting instruction. The cross-pollination of ideas had led to innovative teaching methods that were being adopted by instructors around the world. The academy's waiting list included names that surprised even Jake. Professional athletes from other sports wanted to understand how marksmanship training could improve their mental focus and pressure management skills. Business executives sought instruction in the discipline and patience that had characterized Jake's approach to both shooting and success. Perhaps most significantly, Jake had begun working on a book that would codify his grandfather's teaching methods and make them accessible to shooters who couldn't attend the academy in person. The project was challenging because much of what Jake had learned had been transmitted through hands-on instruction and personal example rather than formal written instruction. The book project had led Jake to conduct extensive interviews with other shooters who had learned from old-school military instructors. These conversations had revealed how widespread the traditional approaches had once been, and how much knowledge had been lost as equipment-focused training methods became dominant. Jake saw the book as an opportunity to preserve and share this wisdom with future generations. Thompson's arrival at the ranch that morning marked the beginning of a weekend clinic that would bring together some of the most accomplished shooters in the country. The guest list included multiple national champions, world record holders, and industry leaders who wanted to experience Jake's teaching methods firsthand. The clinic was designed to be as much about learning from each other as it was about formal instruction. As Thompson unpacked his gear at the shooting bench, he remarked on how the simple facilities at the ranch had produced such extraordinary results. The contrast between the academy's modest infrastructure and the sophisticated ranges where he usually trained was striking. Yet the effectiveness of Jake's methods was undeniable. "You know what I've learned over the past 5 years?" Thompson said as he adjusted his rifle's position on the worn wooden bench. That record you broke wasn't just about shooting a small group. It was about proving that we had overcomplicated something that should be simple. You reminded all of us that marksmanship is still about the fundamentals our grandfathers understood. The weekend clinic would test whether Jake's teaching methods could help even elite-level shooters improve their performance. The participants were not beginners seeking basic instruction. They were accomplished marksmen who had reached plateaus in their development and were looking for insights that might unlock the next level of accuracy. Jake's approach to instructing these advanced shooters differed significantly from typical coaching methods. Instead of focusing on technical adjustments or equipment modifications, he emphasized the mental and philosophical aspects of shooting that his grandfather had taught him. The lessons were as much about understanding oneself as they were about understanding rifles and ammunition. Precision shooting is a conversation between you and your rifle, Jake explained to the assembled group. Most shooters spend so much time talking that they never learn to listen. My grandfather taught me that the rifle will tell you everything you need to know if you're quiet enough to hear it. The concept resonated with several participants who had never considered their relationship with their equipment in such personal terms. The clinic's first exercise involved each participant shooting their normal rifle with their eyes closed after taking aim, relying entirely on their natural ability to repeat the same position and trigger control. The results were revealing, showing how much most shooters depended on visual feedback to correct problems that should have been addressed through better fundamentals. Thompson's performance during the blind shooting exercise surprised everyone, including himself. His groups were significantly smaller than he typically achieved when relying on sight picture adjustments and conscious corrections. The exercise demonstrated that his muscle memory and natural shooting ability were superior to his analytical approach to accuracy. This is exactly what my grandfather meant when he talked about getting out of your own way, Jake observed as they examined Thompson's targets. Your body knows how to shoot accurately, but your mind keeps interfering with the process. Learning. To trust your training instead of constantly trying to manage it is one of the hardest lessons in marksmanship. Other participants had similar revelations during the exercise. Sarah Chen discovered that her meticulous pre-shot routine was actually creating tension that degraded her natural shooting ability. A former military sniper realized that his technical knowledge was sometimes preventing him from trusting the instinctive skills he had developed through years of training. The clinic's second day focused on shooting under artificially induced pressure, with participants attempting to maintain accuracy while being timed, observed, and subjected to distractions. Jake had designed the exercises based on his grandfather's stories about combat shooting, where external factors could easily overwhelm technical training if mental discipline was insufficient. These pressure exercises revealed the true value of Jake's grandfather's teaching methods. Participants who maintained focus on breathing and fundamental technique performed significantly better than those who tried to consciously manage every aspect of their shooting. The lessons about mental discipline proved to be just as important as the technical instruction. By the end of the weekend, several participants had achieved personal best groups using techniques they had learned during the clinic. More importantly, they left with a new understanding of how traditional marksmanship principles could enhance even the most advanced shooting methods. The clinic had successfully bridged the gap between old and new approaches to precision shooting. Word of the clinic's success spread quickly through shooting communities, leading to requests for similar events from organizations around the world. Jake found himself in the position of having to choose between numerous opportunities, each offering the chance to share his grandfather's teaching methods with different audiences. The international interest in Jake's teaching methods led to an invitation that surprised even him. The Swiss national shooting team requested his consultation for their preparation for the upcoming Olympics. Switzerland's reputation for precision in all endeavors made their recognition of Jake's methods particularly meaningful, representing validation from one of the world's most demanding shooting cultures. The Swiss team's training facility was unlike anything Jake had experienced, with equipment and resources that represented the pinnacle of technological advancement in shooting sports. Yet the Swiss coaches were interested specifically in Jake's low-tech, fundamentals-based approach, recognizing that their athletes might benefit from a simpler mental framework during high-pressure competition. Working with Olympic-level athletes required Jake to adapt his teaching methods to individuals who were already technically proficient, beyond what most shooters would ever achieve. The challenge was not teaching them how to shoot accurately, but helping them maintain their exceptional ability under the extreme pressure of international competition. The Swiss athletes initially struggled with Jake's emphasis on relaxation and trust over conscious control and technical perfection. Their training had conditioned them to analyze and adjust every aspect of their performance, making it difficult to embrace the "let it happen" philosophy that had guided Jake's success. But gradually, several team members began to see improvements in their consistency and pressure performance. One athlete, Andreas Müller, experienced a breakthrough during training that exemplified the power of Jake's approach. Müller had been struggling with inconsistent performance in major competitions, despite shooting excellent groups during practice. By learning to trust his fundamentals instead of constantly seeking perfection, he began shooting more consistently, under pressure. "It's like learning to walk again," Müller told Jake after a particularly successful training session. "I had forgotten that I already knew how to shoot accurately. I was trying so hard to be perfect that I was preventing myself from being good." His insight captured the essence of what Jake's grandfather had understood about the relationship between effort and results in precision shooting. The success with the Swiss team led to additional consulting opportunities with national teams and elite athletes from other countries. Jake's methods were being tested at the highest levels of international competition, providing validation that traditional marksmanship principles remained relevant in the modern shooting sports world. But the most personally meaningful project for Jake remained the book he was writing about his grandfather's teaching methods. The manuscript had grown to include not only technical instruction, but also stories and philosophy that captured the deeper aspects of what his grandfather had taught him about shooting and life. Publishing the book would ensure that these lessons would be preserved and available to future generations of shooters. 10 years had passed since that transformative morning at Cedar Ridge, and Jake Martinez stood once again at a shooting range. But this time the circumstances were entirely different. The Olympic Games in Los Angeles had drawn the world's best marksmen to compete for the ultimate prize in precision shooting, and Jake was there not as a competitor but as the most sought-after shooting coach in the world. 3 of his students were competing in various shooting disciplines, each carrying forward the fundamental principles that Jake's grandfather had taught on a simple ranch in New Mexico decades earlier. The irony was not lost on Jake that his grandfather's old-school military training methods were now being applied at the pinnacle of international sporting competition. Andreas Müller, the Swiss athlete who had experienced his breakthrough years earlier, was considered one of the favorites in the 50-meter rifle competition. His transformation from an overthinking perfectionist to a relaxed, confident shooter had been one of Jake's most satisfying coaching successes. Standing beside Müller at the practice range, Jake felt the same quiet pride his grandfather must have experienced watching his progress as a young shooter. "Remember what we practiced at the ranch," Jake told Müller as they prepared for the final training session before competition began. "Trust the fundamentals, breathe naturally, and let the rifle do what it was designed to do. Everything else is just noise." The advice was simple, but Jake had learned that the most profound truths usually were. The media attention surrounding Jake's presence at the Olympics was intense, but respectful. Journalists wanted to understand how a former auto parts store employee had become one of the most influential figures in precision shooting. The story of his grandfather's teaching and the record-breaking performance at Cedar Ridge had become legendary in shooting circles, inspiring a new generation of marksmen to focus on fundamentals over equipment. Jake's book, The Last Lesson, A Grandfather's Guide to Precision, had become required reading at shooting schools around the world. The combination of technical instruction, philosophical insights, and personal stories had resonated with readers far beyond the shooting community. Business leaders, athletes from other sports, and even students studying under pressure had found value in the lessons about patience, preparation, and mental discipline. The Martinez Marksmanship Academy back in New Mexico had expanded to include multiple ranges and facilities, but Jake had been careful to maintain the intimate, personal atmosphere that made his teaching methods effective. Class sizes remained small, and every student still learned on the original range where Jake's grandfather had passed down his knowledge. Sarah Chen had joined the academy as a full-time instructor after retiring from competitive shooting. Her journey from defeated competitor to dedicated teacher exemplified the transformative power of Jake's approach. She had discovered that sharing the fundamentals with others was even more rewarding than personal competitive success. "You know what's funny?" Chen said as she watched Muller prepare for his Olympic competition. "I used to think that losing to you at Cedar Ridge was the worst thing that could happen to my shooting career. Now I realize it was the best thing. It forced me to examine everything I thought I knew about accuracy and led me to discover what really matters." The Olympic competition itself was a testament to the global influence of Jake's teaching methods. Competitors from multiple countries had trained at the academy or studied Jake's techniques through his book and video series. The fundamentals-based approach was no longer seen as old-fashioned or inferior to high-tech training methods. It was recognized as an essential foundation for achieving elite performance. Muller's performance in the preliminary rounds was steady and confident, reflecting the mental composure he had developed through Jake's training. Instead of the anxious perfectionism that had plagued his earlier career, Muller approached each shot with calm focus and trust in his preparation. The improvement in his mental game was visible to anyone who had followed his career. As the final round approached, Jake received a call that brought unexpected news. The Smithsonian Institution had expressed interest in acquiring his grandfather's original rifle and documentation for an exhibit on American marksmanship traditions. The recognition that his grandfather's teaching methods had historical significance was both humbling and gratifying. "He never sought recognition for what he did," Jake told the museum curator during their conversation. "He just wanted to pass on what he had learned to someone who would value it and use it wisely. Knowing that his lessons might inspire future generations through your exhibit would have meant more to him than any trophy or record." Muller's final performance in the Olympic competition was everything Jake had hoped to see. Each shot was executed with the relaxed confidence that came from trusting years of preparation and fundamental training. When the final scores were announced, Muller had not only won the gold medal, but had also set a new Olympic record in the process. The victory celebration was subdued and meaningful rather than wild and excessive. Muller understood that his success represented more than just personal achievement. It was validation of traditional marksmanship principles that many had dismissed as outdated. The gold medal belonged as much to Jake's grandfather, who had never lived to see the full impact of his teaching, as it did to the athlete who wore it around his neck. Jake's presence at the Olympics had attracted attention from coaches and athletes in other precision sports. Archery coaches wanted to understand how his mental preparation techniques might benefit their athletes. Golf instructors were curious about his approaches to dealing with pressure and maintaining consistency. The principles his grandfather had taught were proving to have applications far beyond shooting sports. The return journey to New Mexico after the Olympics gave Jake time to reflect on how far he had traveled from that nervous young man who had arrived at Cedar Ridge with modest equipment and high hopes. The transformation had been gradual but profound, shaped by countless students, competitions, and opportunities to share his grandfather's wisdom with others. Back at the ranch, Jake resumed his morning routine with the same Remington 700 that had started everything. The rifle showed its age now, with honest wear marks that told the story of thousands of rounds fired in pursuit of accuracy and understanding. But it remained as capable as ever in the hands of someone who understood its characteristics and respected its history. The Academy's next class was scheduled to begin the following week, with students arriving from 6 different countries. Among them was a young woman from Iowa whose story reminded Jake of his own journey. She had learned to shoot from her great-uncle, a Korean War veteran who had taught her the same fundamental principles that Jake's grandfather had passed down. Standing at the shooting bench where it all began, Jake understood that his role was not to create shooters in his own image, but to help each student discover their own path to accuracy and excellence. His grandfather's greatest lesson had not been about shooting technique, but about the importance of passing knowledge forward to those who would value and protect it. The record Jake had set at Cedar Ridge still stood after 10 years, though. Several shooters had come tantalizingly close to matching it. But Jake had come to understand that the real significance of that day was not the numbers on the target, but the moment when he had proven that fundamentals, patience, and respect for tradition could still triumph in a modern world that often forgot their value. As the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, Jake cleaned his grandfather's rifle with the same care and attention he had been taught as a child. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to share the lessons that had shaped his understanding of accuracy and life. The tradition would continue, just as his grandfather had always intended it would.